Thank you for joining us for Patient Conversations with Leah, a place where patients and caregivers can talk with me about the real, relevant, and yes, even the raw aspects of their lung cancer journey. Because we want to know and understand these perspectives firsthand from those who are the true experts on what life is like for a young adult diagnosed with lung cancer. Welcome to another episode of Young Lung Cancer's Patient Conversations with Leah. Today on our show, we are meeting with Heather. She was diagnosed at 36 years old with ALK Positive stage 4 lung cancer. And she was actually diagnosed in June of 2020, which, as we well know, was in the middle of the pandemic. So on this first part of our conversation, we're going to let Heather share a little bit with us about her diagnosis and kind of what makes it unique. So Heather, if you want to just start by explaining your diagnosis to us, that'd be great.
Sure. So, looking back now after being diagnosed, I realized there was a lot of red flags that I had that went along with lung cancer that I had explained away myself for different reasons, because who would have ever thought at 36 years old, never having smoked, it would be lung cancer. So knowing now what I know, there were some red flags there. But what really set everything off was I realized that I had a large mass pop up right above my left collarbone. And it was about baseball sized by the time I noticed it. So I immediately went to an urgent care that day that I saw it. And the provider at the time was appropriately concerned, and she knew right away. Actually, she shared with me that she used to be an oncology provider, nurse practitioner. She was now like in the urgent care setting, but she said, I don't want to scare you, but these are concerning, and let's get you in to get an ultrasound, let's get you to a CT scan, let's do some lab work. She started listing off all these things she wanted to do. However, the next morning I got a call that because insurance requires that I have a well, they weren't going to let me do everything. They were like, you've got to do this before you can do that. So they weren't going to let me do all of the things that she had ordered, unfortunately. So I had to start with an ultrasound. So I went that day, the very next day after she ordered it, I went and I had the ultrasound. And when I followed up with my primary care provider about the ultrasound, they shared with me that the ultrasound had been read as benign and non-malignant. So my primary care provider at the time told me, oh, she should not have scared you like that. Like, you don't have cancer. Um, this is just a cyst. They called it a cyst. So they basically just gave me antibiotics, told me that I probably had like bronchitis. They said it was bronchitis. Gave me antibiotics and sent me home. Still not explaining why I have this large cyst all of a sudden. So, I went home and I didn't want to believe it was anything worse. So I kind of just grabbed that and held on to it and went on my way. I took the antibiotics, but I realized like that cyst isn't going anywhere. It wasn't growing, but it wasn't going away. And I continued to still not feel well. Like, I was having a chronic cough. I was having shortness of breath. I was just very tired all the time. I was having a lot of back pain. I was starting to have back pain. And so it was just all these weird things happening throughout my body that didn't seem connected. So it was just bizarre, like, what is happening? So, I went back to my primary care provider. She diagnosed me with the atypical pneumonia now, gave me some more antibiotics, and sent me back on my way. I knew at this point I was getting really concerned. I kept on just feeling worse and worse. I wasn't getting improvements with this antibiotics. And so I kept going back. I kept going back to my doctor, something's really wrong here. But during this time, COVID was hitting. So now that added a whole nother complexity to things, because a lot of the symptoms that I was experiencing were also the same symptoms that people with COVID were experiencing. So then my provider was just adamant that it was COVID. Even though they kept testing me and it kept coming back as COVID. And I kept trying to explain to them, I've had all of these symptoms way longer than what we even knew, before we even knew COVID existed. So I knew it wasn't COVID. Um, and by that point too, again, just like I mentioned, I was having like the back pain, weight loss, unexplained weight loss, night sweats, all these red flags of cancer. But I felt like she thought I was crazy, to be honest, because everything was just so all over the place with my concerns and my complaints. the signs and symptoms I was experiencing. So I feel like she just was kind of writing me off and not really listening to me anymore. So I decided I needed to find a new provider. But the problem was because of COVID, nobody was taking new patients, and it was going to be a good like 3 months before I could even get seen by anybody um, to be evaluated. So I was just kind of starting to panic, like something serious is happening here. I don't know what it is. I can't even get into anybody to get help. Um, and so I was still kind of finishing up the rounds of antibiotics they had given me, and I was finally on the last day. And so I said, I've got to go back to urgent care. So I ended up back in urgent care, and I ended up back with the very first nurse practitioner provider I had seen in the very beginning. And she remembered me immediately. And she said, I've been so worried about you. I wanted to know what was happening. And by that point, it had, you know, this all started in March when I very first went to the doctor with the mass was March 2020. And so now we're into late May. By the time I've ended up back with her. And so she says, Heather, this is going on too long. Like, you need to go to the emergency room right now. I'm going to call them and tell them you're coming. So I did. I drove straight to the emergency room, and I was taken back fairly quickly. But the problem was, again, COVID. They were just so overwhelmed with COVID patients, which was a very severe, thing to be dealing with at the time for the healthcare providers. So, at the time I didn't have, it wasn't like I was acutely shortness of breath to where it was an emergency, but it was at that point, like I didn't know what else to do. And so the provider even said to me, like, what are you doing here? Like, this is something you should be doing as an outpatient. And I said, I've been trying. This is where my provider told me to come. So can you please give me a CT scan? And so it was almost like I had to beg them for it, because even at first they weren't willing to do it. But the ER physician came back in the room and told me they saw it in my face that I was like, not you too, like as if I was like a battle with them to get this stuff done. So they agreed. They did the CT scan. And then shortly after, they came into the room and told me that I lit up like a Christmas tree. And they said, you need to follow up with an oncologist. And they sent me home. So I went back home. I had an oncology appointment scheduled, but I ended up back in the emergency room before I could even make it to that appointment, because by that point I was becoming so short of breath. My oxygen saturation just sitting there was in the 70s. So I ended up back in the emergency room. This time they finally admitted me, and I had the biopsy. So I met an oncologist for the first time while I was in the hospital, and we were both pretty set that it was probably going to be lymphoma. We thought it was going to be lymphoma. And, they did the biopsy. They said, you don't need to be here in the hospital to wait on these results. Let's send you home. They sent me home on oxygen. Shortly after, I did finally meet with the oncologist, and he did share with me, you have stage 4 lung cancer. So what's wild about it, though, is in the time that I had my scans to confirm like what staging I was, I had already developed so much fluid around my heart. And so I actually got a call from the oncologist that I needed to go to the emergency room because I had a lot of fluid surrounding my heart. So I went to the emergency room, and I had to have an emergent pericardial drain placed. And they actually withdrew about a liter of fluid from the pericardial sac, which had been actually causing me to be in cardiac tamponade, which is basically when your heart has so much pressure it can't adequately pump, which can be deadly. So they did that emergently, pulled the fluid off of me, and then they continued to watch me for the next few days. And unfortunately, the fluid kept coming back fairly quickly. So I ended up having to have a pericardial window placement, a more permanent solution. And the way it was told to me was this was going to be a laparoscopic, easy procedure, and that I could probably even go home the next day. But I actually awoke from that procedure intubated and restrained. Nobody in my room. My nurse call bell did not work. And so that was a pretty terrifying moment. But finally, they came in and addressed me. I was extubated fairly soon after that. But I required about a month stay in the hospital. I was on 60 liters of oxygen for a good month. They could not wean me off. And even though at this point I knew I had lung cancer, I was still awaiting my liquid biopsy, the genomic molecular testing to see if I had any mutations. I was still awaiting that. And I think that was taking longer again because of COVID. So I was just in this limbo in the hospital, not doing well. Like they had not started any treatment per se because we were waiting on those results. So I'm just there on 60 liters, just barely holding on. My oncologist team got together and decided we've got to do something. We can't keep waiting on these results. So they did decide to do a round of chemotherapy, which I did in the hospital on July 4th, 2020. And within a week of doing that chemotherapy, I finally got the results that I was ALK positive. So I was started on the medication, tyrosine kinase inhibitor, alectinib. And within a week of starting that medication, I was able to go home. And I started that medication in July of 2020. And by October of 2020, I was considered no evidence of disease.
Wow.
So it was a wild ride, but I'm very thankful that my medication worked as well as it did for me.
That is quite the diagnosis story. I mean, COVID just complicates everything. Obviously, it did for you as well. And I just, it's just amazing that you kind of got so sick. I mean, we were all sick, but got so, so sick.
I
And
was so ill.
and
I know
then,
there's times like looking back, my mom, like in between the hospital stays before I ended up in the hospital, to have the pericardial drain, I remember my mom staying to kind of keep an eye and help out. And she would wake me up from sleeping because my lips would be turning blue. And she would say, "You need to wake up, your lips are blue." And I would be upset with her, "Mom, I was finally sleeping." I
oh,
was finally sleeping. But she'd say, "No, your lips were blue." So, I mean, I was days away probably from no longer being here.
that is absolutely crazy. And the all of it, I just it's shocking. But what I think is so interesting, because I've talked to so many people, you probably have as well, that are newly diagnosed, not even necessarily EGFR for me or ALK for you, just in general with these biomarkers, and are so sick and feel so bad. And then you said you'd start taking your TKI for ALK, and within a week you felt better and were able to go home. And I think that's something that is important to note, because I've talked to so many people who are just, they just got the prescription for whatever it is, Tagrisso or whatever. And then they're like, I just am so miserable. And I'm like, give it a week or two. You're going to be so
Yes.
surprised. And nobody can really believe it until it happens to them. And I think, what a testament to science, because I mean, here you are doing chemo and not getting the results.
No, not at all. In fact, when I did the first round of chemotherapy, it actually caused me to become septic and it sent me into heart failure. So here I am, waiting for these positive results. Um, I'm telling you, I was days away from no longer being here. I was on 60 liters of oxygen. They weren't able to wean me off of it. But I remember when I got the news that I did have this ALK positive mutation, the oncologists were also excited and so happy when they gave me this news. And they said, "This is great because now this means you can take this new medication. And if it's going to work, it's going to work fast." And they were not kidding. Again, I was able to go from 60 liters down to just 3 liters of oxygen just within 1 week. Um, and then within that same week, I was able to leave the hospital and go back home. I mean, July to October, that's not long at all to go from lighting up like a Christmas tree to no evidence of disease. So it is phenomenal. Yes.
Yeah, that is really amazing. And I'm sure, because people are probably listening and watching and thinking, well, what happened to your original mass that you felt, the cyst on your shoulder, your collarbone? Like, what did that just go away with the
Yeah,
treatment?
it just went away, which is really still interesting to me because even looking back, whenever, the original ultrasound said um, non-malignant, benign, which to me, looking back now, I'm like, there's no way you can really know that without doing a biopsy, but that is how they read it. And I remember whenever I had my biopsy in interventional radiology, I thought for sure that's what they were going to biopsy. And I remember the doctor like doing an ultrasound of it, and he even himself said, "I don't like that for a biopsy. That looks more like a cyst." So even he had that kind of opinion, and he in fact did not biopsy that spot. I ended up having a node in my axilla armpit area that they biopsied instead. So that was very surprising to me as well. But then just after all everything, and I'm having this great response, it went away. So it's just perplexing how
It is crazy.
even though it wasn't cancer per se, they say, um, it still resolved with the treatment. So I'm sure it probably was related in some way, but maybe it just made changes that for whatever reason they didn't see it as cancer. So
That is just crazy. I mean, I think that, obviously COVID brought its own set of issues to your situation of your delayed diagnosis. But, what I hear you saying is I had to be persistent. I had to be my own advocate, going back and forth between primary care physician and immediate care and, back and forth and saying, you said at one point, I think they thought I was crazy, and I had that same experience of going into the primary care's office and just being like, I mean, I know I looked wild-eyed and crazy, but I was just sick, sick, sick. And I knew something was wrong and I couldn't get answers and standing there. And I know they sent the nurse practitioner out for more of a mental health check than anything. But she listened and she ordered the CT. So, I think it's interesting that although we have two different mutations, our stories are different, that common theme of having to be a self-advocate is there.
absolutely.
And I'll wrap up here soon, but I just want you to explain to people, you thought you had a lymphoma. That was the thing. And in hindsight, had you known lung cancer was something you could have gotten or, had, would that have been something that would have been easier to rule out or discern more quickly if you'd known that lung cancer was something young adults could get?
I believe so. I believe so. I actually work in the healthcare field. I'm a physical therapist, and I remember learning in school about lung cancer. And even in my training, there was just so much emphasis put on smoking. And yes, I learned like the red flags as mentioned, chronic cough. I knew that was a red flag of lung cancer, but for me, because of my training and my knowledge, I never would have thought somebody my age as a non-smoker, it could be lung cancer. I never went there. Even with a chronic cough and weight loss, unexplained weight loss and night sweats, like all these major red flags of cancer, I didn't put the pieces together myself. I blamed them all away on things like my chronic cough. I said, oh, it's allergies. I've always had allergies. It's allergies. That's all, the tiredness. Oh, I'm stressed out from work, just everything I explained away. So I think our training needs to change. The training for these healthcare providers needs to change because they do put such an emphasis. And yeah, I just feel like most healthcare providers out there, unfortunately, have no clue that this is happening to us at young ages and non-smokers.
Right. I agree. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your story with us today. I know it's hard to at some, different parts in your journey, and feels like you've kind of made peace with what it is and how well you're doing. And not that it's an easy journey, because this is not an easy journey, no matter where you are in your journey or what stage you're diagnosed. So, I commend you for sharing that. And this is going to be a multi-part series. So I hope our listeners will tune in to the second part, where we're going to delve into some more kind of other issues that arise with young lung cancer diagnosis in your personal life. Like, how does a lung cancer diagnosis affect someone at 36, 37, 38 years old, and kind of disrupt your normal young adulthood? So again, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate it. I hope that you feel like you've shared your story and now people can learn, and you've brought visibility to this diagnosis, because it's remarkable that you're here and no evidence of disease. So thank you very much. That's right.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Leah. Thanks for having me.